Hello everyone, today we're going to be talking about armor in World War I. And no, I'm not talking tanks. I mean literal armor. Let's jump right into this. So over the course of history, the adoption of gunpowder effectively made the idea of the knight in shining armor obsolete. Didn't really work anymore. Body armor over the course of centuries would gradually begin to disappear from European armies, as instead they would focus on massed firepower versus individualized protection, as it wasn't really working anymore. However, the absolutely terrifying, awful, and horrible conditions of World War I really made some planners go back and rethink their strategy and what it is that they were doing. Could they actually use body armor as a way by which they could protect infantry from enemies so that they could approach positions? I mean, in theory, if a man was sufficiently well armored, he could reach the enemy positions even in the absence of any kind of ground cover and then engage the enemy at close quarters. And of course, we're talking about in World War I, when there was a massive no man's land between enemy trenches that you didn't step into, or else you got shot. Probably a lot. Now, this was a concept that was pretty appealing before the idea of the tank, as by this point, the only real way to attack an enemy's trench was to rush them with overwhelming numbers and or firepower. And thus, during World War I, all major combatants of both sides really tried to experiment with different types of body armor to see what it is that they could do with it. Metal helmets were used by Germany and the Allies, and both sides experimented with full body armor in an effort to give their troops some kind of protection against bullets and shrapnel, essentially turning the soldier into a walking tank, or perhaps I guess more like a throwback to a medieval knight in armor. But among all the different powers, Italy is actually the one that made the most extensive use of armored soldiers, specifically with its Arditi units. Now, the first mention of the Arditi came in 1916 at the initiative of young officers who served in the Italian front line facing the Austro-Hungarian army. These guys were tired of trench warfare. The officers at this time suggested that a new unit should be formed that would be comprised strictly of volunteers and would serve as a vanguard in seizing enemy positions. And these volunteers were to be selected from only the bravest men, and it also came with a couple conditions. With one of these conditions being the fact that the soldiers had to be resilient to artillery noise, which is not something that everyone was accustomed to, because the Arditi was to charge the enemy trenches while friendly artillery was still pounding. Now, this was still a really risky tactic, but if it worked, then this would enable the Italian Arditi to approach enemy trenches while they were still ducking for cover from the artillery fire. If they were able to get close enough, then their losses would be less by the time that they actually stormed the trenches. If it worked, mind you. The men who would be storming these positions were mostly picked from elite existing units, such as the Bersaglieri or the Alpini, which were mountain troops, both of which were known for their strength, their courage, and their stamina. Now, one of the funny things is, the Arditi were encouraged to not actually take their guns with them. Instead, these men in modern warfare were armed with two types of weapons. One was a distinctive dagger that they would carry, and the other was a pair of hand grenades. Which sounds absolutely terrifying. Often a number of the men were armored using the Farina trench helmet, named after its designer, and they also carried metal breastplates and armor around their legs and arms. The heavy steel plating would make it rather difficult to move, which meant that even though the soldiers had some protection against enemy bullets, it also made them an easy target. Something that, on occasion, really did not work out well for them. When they were attacking an enemy position, they preferred to use the Thevenot hand grenade, which, although it provided a rather limited, weak explosion in comparison to other types of grenades, that was in comparison to the noise that it made once it was activated, which was astronomically more. This would cause terrible confusion among the entrenched enemy soldiers who would be dazed by the artillery barrage. For any attacks against bunkers and pillboxes, the Arditi would use flamethrowers and small caliber infantry cannons, which were easier to carry. But their main weapon, the thing that made them very notorious and famous, was the dagger. These guys were highly skilled in hand-to-hand combat and would jump into an enemy trench and massacre absolutely everyone inside. Even though it would seem that that would be a very outdated tactic at the time of World War I, it actually proved to be remarkably effective. Standard issue infantry weapons were often long bolt-action rifles, which were of very little use in direct fighting unless you flipped it around and kind of used it as a club. But even then, it's not going to really help you as much in an enclosed trench. And it's not like the Arditi were just some guys that were given knives and told, hey you, go jump in this trench, stab a dude. These men were trained. They were trained along the lines of fencing and martial arts manuals, something that was entitled The Flower of Battle that was written in the 14th century. Mind you, again, we're talking the 14th century, this being 500 years prior to World War I. And this was all done by a knight by the name of Fiore de Liberi. Of course, with such training in close combat, this meant that they were an exceptionally deadly force, and in comparison to the soldiers that they were going up against that had maybe been issued standard bayonets and given rudimentary drills on how to use them, they were in for a very bad time once they actually encountered this kind of close combat. And all of this centers around the Arditi's motto: we either win or we all die. These troops were shock troops, and sometimes the warfare and battles that they engaged in could be described as suicidal charges. Their casualties were as much as 25 or 30% for each mission. On one such occasion, while attacking Monte Osvaldo in April of 1916, an entire Arditi unit, comprised of 13 officers and 400 soldiers, were just simply completely wiped out. Although their success rate was rather favorable, overall, the entire thing was a very, very dangerous calling. After the war was over, in 1920, the Arditi were officially disbanded. But because of their presence in the public eye and what it is that they had managed to accomplish as veterans, after the war, they still managed to involve themselves in a number of political cases on both sides, both pro and anti-fascist. In the end, they would be a symbol for Italy for years and years to come. All of it stemming from the fact that they were literal knights in a day of guns and bullets. Thank you everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe down below. I want you to make sure to put your comments letting me know what it is that we should do next, because I'm always looking for suggestions in the comment section. I hope you all have a good rest of your day, and please, join us next time. Goodbye, guys.